Welcome to At the Bar, a spirited conversation about issues at the intersection of law, politics, and culture. I'm Jennifer Braceras from Independent Women's Law Center, and I'm here as usual with my colleague Inez Stepman from Independent Women's Forum.
And today, I really wish we had continued the tradition of we used to film these in the late afternoons or happy hours. So we used to do them with a drink. I really wish we had been able to film this one that late because this topic makes me so angry. Like I think I need a glass of wine to
5 o'clock
calm down.
somewhere, Inez.
Yeah. But today we're going to be talking about the recent scandal at Stanford Law School in which a mob of angry students shouted down and attempted to essentially intellectually ambush a federal judge who was speaking on campus. Judge Kyle Duncan of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. He attempted to deliver his talk at the invitation of the FedSoc chapter of Stanford Law School. So students initially completely disrupted the judge's remarks, calling him a scumbag, a liar, and a racist, and screaming questions like, "Why do you hate Black people?" And then, of course, an administrator entered the fray and actually made everything worse rather than better. Of course, this is just the latest episode of these kinds of woke hysterical incidents that are enveloping the nation's universities and beyond the universities, really. I mean, we've seen these kinds of incidents take place in media organizations and in Fortune 500 companies
And
as
restaurants
well.
where people are dining peacefully with their spouses.
Yeah. But they really are happening at an alarming rate in our elite law schools, which poses its own set of problems, I think, for the study of law, as well as for the society at large. So, Jennifer, can you introduce our first guest?
Yeah, we're thrilled to be joined today by Tim Rosenberger, who is a student at Stanford Law School and president of Stanford's chapter of the Federal Society, which sponsored the event. So welcome, Tim. Thank you for making time for this. And why don't we start off by just giving you the floor and letting you tell people about the event, why you invited Judge Duncan to campus, what he was supposed to talk about, and what unfolded, and whether you had any sense before it happened that something was brewing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you both for having me on, and I'm really happy your viewers are interested in hearing about what's going on at Stanford. As you said, I'm the president of the Stanford chapter, and Judge Duncan was actually the first person we invited when we were setting up our calendar for this year. We're always really excited when circuit judges, any judges, but particularly circuit judges, want to come out to California. We're not the easiest place to visit, and so we were grateful to him for agreeing to come. We invited him in May, actually, so we put him on the schedule then, and we're really interested in hearing what's going on in the Fifth Circuit because so many contentious legal issues go through that circuit, particularly affirmative litigation on the right. Being in the Ninth Circuit, we have sort of a front row seat to a lot of that happening on the left, but we don't get to see it so much on the right. So we're really excited to have Kyle Duncan join us. We did get a little bit of an advance notice something was going to go wrong, although we definitely didn't have an idea of how bad it would be. So a week before the event, so the weekend preceding the Thursday event, an email was sent from the person who would eventually lead the mob to the entire board. And this email said, please cancel this event, or in the alternate, move it away from the law school.
I'm sorry, who sent the letter? An administrator?
No, this was a student. This was the student who would eventually lead the mob.
And the student asked you to cancel the event or move it.
Yeah, cancel the event, move it out off the law school, or move it onto Zoom. And I'm really disappointed actually that there were people who thought that seemed like a fine idea. We would just sort of tell this judge who was flying in all the way from Louisiana to be with us. Yeah, thanks for coming. Let's have a dinner, and then here's your Zoom link.
Correct.
And, I wasn't
back to your hotel room and log on.
Right. I'm happy to say that we had sort of a strong core of people who prevailed, and that didn't happen. And so I wrote back an email that I thought was a conciliatory email, and I said, our event's going to proceed as planned, but you're always welcome to come and ask questions. And if anybody wants to talk to me individually, here's my cell phone number, and I'm happy to meet. Nobody took me up on that. Anyway, Thursday, I took the judge out for coffee because we were, he was a bit early and we were waiting for things to start. So we went over to the coffee shop and said, how bad do you think this is going to be? There were sort of all of these posters up, right? There were posters with the headshots of my board members, including me, like a very young and thin headshot of me. So that was nice. But they had that up. They had, various alleged wrongs of Judge Duncan. And they had really the most troubling sign was a sign that went through, that insinuated pretty strongly that Judge Duncan's decisions are a direct cause of trans suicide. And this was really upsetting because, we had a member of our chapter who is trans commit suicide last year. So it was sort of just a really despicable thing to do. And so, and
This is a trans member of the Federalist Society.
yes, uh, completed suicide last year. And so they had these signs. That was clearly the insinuation of these signs, right? That Judge Duncan had his decisions had precipitated the death of this person. So that was upsetting. But I thought, there are signs. People at Stanford University are pretty at the chill of the top 3 law schools. People will have a little protest, then they'll be on their way. That's sort of what we've had in the past. And so as he and I were walking back to the law school, we could hear this din. Like there was this sound, and I'm now told that part of what I was hearing is the protesters, apparently with the administration's support, help, something, were having like sort of a block party going on in like the main student lounge. So they were doing this like party atmosphere and they were playing music. But I could hear just like voices, right? It's very like, so he and I walked into the building and there's this hallway. The way the law school set up, you've got to sort of walk through this hallway to get to the room he was in. And it was just lined on both sides with people with painted faces and signs.
Painted faces.
Yeah, painted faces. There was a painted poodle mix dog painted as the trans flag, and they were waving these signs at him and yelling at him and yelling pretty horrible and personal things, right? Yelling, they hoped that his family members would be raped because he had helped them with their jobs, and yelling that just horrible things at him. So we walk into the room. And there was a good core of Federal Society members there, but the room was, the protesters were not in the room. They'd already posted it, but there weren't that many protesters in the room. And then, just as we were about to start, the mob moved in from the hall into the room and sort of took over, filled the corridors and was, filling the space. And so I did the introduction and sort of, there was already a lot of noise and booing, but I just sort of read through my prepared introduction like I was doing a hostage tape, and then handed it off to the judge. And he was, not going to just read his remarks to a room that couldn't hear him. He tried to get started, and there was this just din and crosstalk. He would say something like, we have to have a free exchange of ideas, and somebody would yell, what about freedom for Black voters and wherever, or we have to agree on difference. And he's like, what about people with different genders? I mean, it was just this constant crosstalk, but also noise. And this went on for 15-ish minutes, at which point the DEI team came down. I thought to say, we have a policy against disruptions. We're going to start ejecting people. But instead, as you saw in that tape, there was sort of this prepared speech. And at that point, this was sort of an unsalvageable event. It was an hour-long thing.
We actually have a little clip from that portion. And it sounds to me, I gather from what you say, it's like a lot of the stuff that transpired before that is much worse. But this is the piece where we're going to run.
And to this room, because you're asking into the room as well. Is that okay?
Associate Dean, what do you want to say?
She doesn't need your permission. Is that okay? Because you are also talking to the room.
You asked for an administrator. She is an administrator.
You just asked for an administrator in here.
You want an echo chamber, or you want someone to
No,
handle
Can I say something, Tim? Is that okay? Is that okay?
So you've invited me to speak here, and I'm being heckled nonstop. And I'm just asking for an administrator to sign.
That's an
administrator. Your racism is showing.
In what way?
Wait,
Respect Black women.
If you want a marketplace of ideas, you have gotten what you wanted, take
Can
it.
I help?
Like, do you want an echo chamber? What's the issue?
Can I help?
I guess I have prepared remarks, but
And I want you to be able to. I
letting
want
me
you to be
get.
able to get a prepared remarks. Okay.
Yes, please.
And I had to write something down because I'm so uncomfortable up here. And I don't say that for sympathy. I just say I'm deeply, deeply uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable because this event is tearing at the fabric of this community that I care about and I'm here to support. And I don't know, and I have to ask myself, and I'm not a cynic to ask this, is the juice worth the squeeze? Is this worth it? It isn't a setup. But for many people in this law school who work here, who study here, and who live here, your advocacy, your opinions from the bench land as absolute disenfranchisement of their rights and does land. Let me please. Let me finish.
So, looking at that video, I mean, I was worried, like I said on the outset, that I'm just going to get too angry to talk about that. There's something about the way that DEI dean talks that makes me want to, it sets my teeth on edge and makes me want to like get extremely angry. But I guess two questions. One, what was it like in the room after the administrator spoke? Because that's when a lot of the videos sort of cut off. Was there any calming down of anything? And then the second thing is the university did issue a letter of apology afterwards that included the phrase, "What happened was inconsistent with our policies on free speech, and we are very sorry about the experience you had while visiting our campus." And this is an apology to Judge Duncan. So do you feel that apology is sufficient?
Well, to your first question, there is definitely a change in the atmosphere after that dean speaks. So, Dean Steinbach gives that speech. Duncan goes back up to the lectern. The mob continues briefly, and then the man you can see sort of standing next to her in the maroon shirt, who's like her little sidekick, then goes and confers with like the leader of the mob, like front and center, like head protester, who stands up and says, I want half of you to leave and protest, and I want half of you to stay and like bear witness and protest. So a whole bunch of people leave, and the room, the change in the mix of people does help at that point, to the extent that it's less like it seems like it's going to break into melee. But the judge, this is an hour-long event. We're now 30 some minutes in. The event's over, right? Like the time to talk about Twitter and gun regulation has passed. So Duncan just goes directly into a Q&A, and that goes, I mean, it's not the same, just like tense, loud fracas, but it's still a mess. A student gets into it with him. This guy's holding a sign that says, Kyle Duncan can't find the clit. And Duncan says, what does that mean? And the guy yells at, again, Fifth Circuit judge, I'm a gay man. I fuck men. I can find a prostate. Why can't you find the clit? And so it did not get better. And eventually we have
What
a
is
couple
wrong
questions.
with people?
Yeah, I mean, we have a couple exchanges like that, at which point we just call it, and it's sort of getting tense again. And the marshals take me and the judge out, and the mob sort of descends on the remaining Federalists.
Wait, why were you taken out?
This really reminds me, by the way, of to show that none of this is new except the administration's response. Mr. Samler's Planet by Saul Bellow. There's a scene in that book where the students in the 60s are screaming at their professor, like, this old man's like, his bolts are dry, he can't F, right? Like the same kind of stuff. And apparently that scene came from Saul Bellow's experience in the universities.
But of course, the interesting change, I want to get to your second question you asked earlier, but the interesting change you see in this video is that the students are not anti-administration. They are with that dean, right? They start with like, she's a dean, you have to speak. And then when that doesn't work, they move to saying, well, you're not letting her speak is racism. You're somebody yell, your racism is showing. And so the students are no longer anti-university. They are, the university
Because
and the
those
mom
students from the
are on the team.
1960s grew up and became the deans.
Right.
Yeah.
100%. I mean, this is a very big change. It's not, there's no president or dean of a university who's going to say, students come in and do something like this, I'm calling in the National Guard, or, I'm calling the governor, or I'm going to, arrest protesters. They're just like, we're fine with this. Your question was, is that apology sufficient? I guess sufficient for what? I think it is, sufficient is like a first step, which is apologizing to the judge. I think that was very important and needed to happen. I'm glad it happened. But I would point out this event was Thursday lunchtime. That apology came out co-signed by the president of the university over the weekend after a number of reporters, including Ed, who you're going to speak with in a little bit, got this on Twitter and were writing articles. I mean, everyone in the country, it seemed like, knew about this problem before that, solid but a little tepid apology came out.
All right. Well, speaking of Ed, let's bring Ed Whelan on to talk about this. He was the person that I think broke this story nationally by posting about it on Twitter. Ed is the Distinguished Senior Fellow and past president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and author of National Review's Bench Memos column. Maybe most importantly, he's the father-in-law to our esteemed colleague, Charlotte Whelan, who works with us at Independent Women's Forum. So it's great to have you here, Ed.
Great to be with you.
Just have to put in a little plug for my friend Aaron Siberium. I think he also gets credit for breaking this story nationwide. But I do want to ask, while I have you both here, the most important question, which is what is actually to be done? What ought to happen in response, assuming that the university is not going to, for example, fire the dean that instigated this and continued this kind of mob behavior. The students presumably will face no major consequences for having participated in it, doled out by the university. Now, I'd be very happy to be wrong about either one of those things, but let's assume for the sake of argument that they don't happen, as they have not happened in, I want to say, similar incidents, but this is a new level, obviously, with the involvement of a federal judge, right? So what is to be done? Should we go with Judge Ho's suggestion that, should Republican appointed judges be excluding schools, or at least excluding everyone who isn't brave enough to put their names on the Federalist Society from the clerks list? Like, what is the response? Because very clearly this is this is the atmosphere in our elite law schools.
Well, pardon me for fighting your premise a bit. You are probably correct that Stanford will do nothing with respect to the DEI dean or with respect to the students. But I don't think we can simply accept that. I think we need to emphasize how outrageous that is. The apology from Stanford's president and the law school dean specified that the administrators who were there didn't do what they were supposed to do and instead made things worse. There definitely ought to be consequences for the DEI dean. As for the students, they were on clear notice, this written policy that Stanford has on free speech, that there's a line between what one might call counter speech and disruption. And the same apology said that they clearly crossed that line. There's disruption. The same written notice, this policy says that in the past, penalties have ranged from censure to expulsion. That's the range. So we need at the minimum censure. So I'm just, again, Stanford deserves all sorts of criticism if it doesn't take these obvious, basic, direct steps. Frankly, once you get past these steps and try to figure out what outsiders can try to do to improve the environment at Stanford, things get a lot tougher.
So, I agree with both you and Inez in the sense that I don't think we should, the public should not accept that the school will do nothing. But I also agree with Inez that the school is likely to do nothing more.
As
and
do I.
I think part of the reason is I think that the composition of the student body of these places has been changing. Now, Inez says some of this was going on when she was in law school. Certainly it was going on when I was in law school, and I'm much older than Inez. So it's definitely been happening for decades. but it has gotten worse. It has gotten more aggressive, and it is starting to involve staff. And I think that's because schools are deliberately admitting more activists. It's, they can pretend that they're the institution that's being protested, but in fact, they're collaborating, as Tim said earlier.
Well, and I think too that students have become more aggressive in what their activism is. So I think you may still be drawing from the same cohort, but these are folks who are ready to cross some lines that people wouldn't have done some time ago. Well, let me take a stab at answering the specific question. Assuming that Stanford's not going to do anything, what can others do? What, for example, can federal judges do? Well, in this very polarized environment, it's going to be difficult to get any sort of consensus approach. But I'd love to see it become known that federal judges will ask clerkship applicants to submit in writing whether they have disrupted anyone's speaking at a public event, and if so, to describe the circumstances. Now, again, if that's just done by conservative judges and the progressive students who disrupt speech aren't interested in clerking for them anyway, maybe that doesn't accomplish much. I don't know. But there may be a problem too with some conservative students who have allowed themselves, for understandable reasons, to be bullied by some of these progressive students, and maybe they need to be stiffened up a bit and not acquiesce in these disruptions.
Tim, I'd love to get your commentary on that. I mean, you were in that room. Do you think there's anything that you could have done to change this environment? And I'm not trying to throw this back on you by any means. None of us were in that room. And so the question is, like, with 2020 hindsight, do you think there's anything you could have done, or was the environment so out of control that you were sort of powerless to stop the goings on?
A couple quick points I want to make. Related to what Jennifer said about universities admitting activists, you can find Stanford professors who will go on the record and say that, I think about 5 years ago, our provost, in talking about what Stanford is looking for, university-wide, said we are looking for activists. Right. And that is not a secret. That is an out loud thing. I think something people don't understand is I've been on a lot of calls this week, and people say, oh, we're gonna write letters to the dean. We're gonna quit giving. Stanford has $40 billion. 40 billion with a B dollars. Everyone can quit giving today, and if they really want to, if the constituencies that matter, which are unfortunately the rabble and the student and / administrative faculty, if they all really want to keep driving the ship this way, they have $40 billion to do it, right? And so I don't think we can give up on these institutions because they just have so much power and so much money. But at the same time, I think that saying I'm going to quit giving my $200 a year or whatever to Stanford, that's not going to make a difference. And so we need to do something a bit stronger. You said, what could I have done differently about this event? This has been very disappointing for me because sort of the rationale for my year as Fed Stock president was, we were not going to be Yale. Right, we were going to be a big, strong, and fun group. We were going to have great relationships with our administrators. We talked with them often. We were going to try to do events with other student groups. No takers, right? Like early in the year, last year, ACS had this bizarre thing. They said they would only do an event with us if I personally certified the 2020 election. There were just all of these totally weird things, and and so this feels like a complete repudiation of my theory of the Federal Society, right? We shouldn't have been. The fact that this happened to a federal judge suggests that we should have had Ann Coulter the first week. They could have gotten it out of their systems, and then we would have been fine. It's just there's going to be this sort of ritual mob of some conservative speaker periodically, and if the most objectionable person happens to be a federal judge, they're going to be subjected to this. So, I think that there's something to be said for being a lot more aggressive. And it turns out that working very hard to be conciliatory and build relationships gets you exactly zero. And I'm really disappointed by this.
As George W. Bush learned the second he set foot in Washington.
I have just want to insert here. either one of you can answer this, and Jennifer can as well. But I think it's worth pointing out here what the underlying offense, allegedly, of Judge Duncan actually is. So, Tim, do you want to tell us what the alleged excuse for this level of disruption and protest was?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of the big laundry list of any objectionable decision from the Fifth Circuit since he's been there, objectionable to the left, right? But the hook, the primary thing is a situation in which the judge refused to refer to a defendant by their preferred pronouns. And in this situation, this was a criminal defendant who had been convicted of a sex offense. After conviction, changed their pronouns, and the judge was like not having it and didn't abide by their preferred pronouns. And so pronouns, that's what got us all of this.
If I may, it was even worse than that in the sense that the opinion that Judge Duncan issued understood the prisoner to be asking for an order compelling the district court and the government to refer to him by his new pronouns. Judge Duncan spelled out that he had no authority to do so. He also put in this chart of whatever, the 76 different sets of pronouns that people are using, and just showing how unworkable this would be. It's quite quite a thin reed on which to heap all this abuse.
Yeah, I mean, what's so pathetic about this, but perhaps most interesting about it, is it in some sense it didn't really matter, as you said, whether it was Judge Duncan or some other judge or Ann Coulter, right? And these things are happening all over the country. There was an incident at Yale Law School last school year that actually involved my stepmother, Kate Stith, a professor there, who was moderating an event. And it was an event with a speaker from the left and the right who were there to talk about about free speech. There were objections. I mean, you can't even have a debate, right? It's not just that you can't bring conservative speakers. You can't even have a debate with somebody on the other side. And the students did, essentially the same thing, shouted down the speakers. And Inez, I think we have a graphic that shows from the New York Post about it. But ultimately, after the event, I think there were over 200 students who signed a petition asking that Kate Stith, my stepmother, be sanctioned simply for agreeing to moderate the panel. So the fact that there are 200 Yale law students who think that somebody should be sanctioned for moderating a discussion is, in and of its, I mean, that is just so disturbing to me. And it has serious implications, I think, about the state of the legal profession going forward. And these people are presumably going to become government officials, judges, right? I mean, they go to Yale and Stanford Law School. So in some Democratic administration down the road, these may be the very people who are running the place. To
illustrate the decline, I took part in an event at Yale some 15 years ago or so, where a fellow panelist was being protested by students and by the Yale Law School dean, Harold Coe, who was happy to get in on the picture too. But what they did is their protest was to get up and leave quietly when it was his turn to speak. It seemed a little silly to me at the time, but it's so much better than what's being done now. I wish I had the foresight to salute them back then.
Right. Well, and one of the things that's sort of scary to me is the incident at Yale and the incident at Stanford and these other incidents are if you look at them, they're basically using the same script. And right, so they're being orchestrated. They're not organic, spontaneous events. They say the same things to the protesters. You hurt people I care about. Your opinions cause trauma. Even just you being here on this campus is ripping apart the fabric of our community. It's not worth it. We believe in free speech, but is it really worth it when you're hurting so many people? I mean, it's all exactly the same. And the notion that this is sort of an organic, response to a provocative speaker is not the case. I mean, they're probably planning their next one right now at some other law school.
You're right. There definitely was a feeling that this was much more organized than protests in the past, and I can't figure out really why that was. But I
Because
think
it
you're right.
was.
Well,
And
I can't figure out who had the logistical ability to do that, and also definitely the message seems to be out there to call the university's bluff, because it used to be, oh, the university would purportedly sanction you or eject you or whatever, but now it's pretty clear people understand they can filibuster an event, like they can really just hijack an entire hour if they want to.
What are the consequences? I mean, we're talking about Yale, Stanford, right? These law school classes are going to feed into all of the top law firms. They're going to feed into the Justice Department. They're going to feed into top government agencies. What are the consequences? I guess we'll go with Ed and then Tim. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. What will the consequences, the broader consequences, be when these classes of students are not just DEI administrators in the universities from which they're coming, but quite literally running the government?
Well, as a father of college students, I would emphasize that the problem begins before law school. And it probably begins in most places well before college, and what's happening now in the high schools and grade schools, especially with the political indoctrination on so many issues. But look, when you have people who demonize others, who can't are not willing to engage in reasoned, if vigorous argument. That is, I think, very, very threatening to civil society. I had a nice lunch the other day with a friend of mine who's an ardent liberal. We were able to talk through all sorts of issues and disagreements, understanding that that's what you do. And for those of us who went to law school at a certain time where most of my friends were liberals, we could still talk through things. Sure, they disagree, but there wasn't this, you are not to be part of our community. So I think it's very, very damaging.
Tim, what do you think about the same question? I mean, does it give you pause to think that these among your classmates are likely, going to be wielding a substantial amount of wealth and power in 5 or 10 years?
Well, I think Ed's right that this is a bigger problem than just the elite law schools or just law schools. It's a problem that seems to be across a lot of academia. I think as specifically applies to law, which is your question, I just don't buy that this this can keep working, where schools graduate these very fragile and temperamental people, and then they go to these elite law firms where you're told, work 80 hours a week and work on whatever we put in front of you, and that's why we can charge so much. How are you going to run an elite law firm where everybody you hire says, there are all these different kinds of clients I won't serve. There are all these kinds of judges who I'm too triggered by to appear before. My mental health is such that I can work precisely 30 hours a week. And, I'm going to be perpetually offended by everyone else who works here. I disbelieve that this is going to function. And I don't really know where that ends, right? I think the top law firms have really strong
it doesn't
brands.
end unless the people in charge put their foot down, right?
But,
And as long as
there's
the
more to that.
people,
Like, if people can't do the work, right? If people,
right.
law firms, unlike law school, where we can, Stanford has a bad bar passage rate. It doesn't really have grades. You can spend 3 years being an activist and not learn anything and get the diploma, it turns out. You can't really do that at a law firm, right? Like, law firms have to produce work that is functioning. Can these people do it? Not sure.
Well, I don't know. I mean,
Law firms are like, I mean, I just heard from a friend who got back from a law school retreat, right? And you have junior associates screaming at partners about this stuff. I mean, it doesn't stop in the law schools. It continues into even these firms. And I mean, I think you're right, Tim. Like, at some point, somebody has to do these 80-hour-a-week jobs that actually produce real billable hours. And maybe
right, but
there's
the
a
problem
stopping
is
point
that
somewhere,
they
but
can just. I mean, I believe that the powers that be at most of these law firms are afraid of these people, and they're afraid of being called racist or sexist or traumatizing or whatever, and so they don't put their foot down. Now you're right. If they can't do the work, they'll eventually be chewed up and spit out by these places, only to be replaced by other people just like them, right? So unless the management committee really draws a line in the sand and says, no, we're not even going to entertain these types of complaints, it's going to, I don't know. I mean, I know that's sort of a very doomsday outlook, but I find it very depressing.
Oh, I have a very doomsday outlook. Like, I just don't see this working out. And I think your question about people becoming judges, uh, you're going to end up with a system where you have sort of very federalist judges who say, we're going to look at the text and we're going to do this textual work. You're going to end up with people who are picked to be judges because of their work as activists, and who are just going to say, this is what I want to do. Here you go. And that's going to be catastrophic. I mean, one, you're going to have crazy circuit splits and totally unpredictable decisions. And people are just going to have no confidence at all in our justice system. So if this actually continues the way it's going, things will be catastrophic.
Yeah, though I agree with Inez that the situation is already, from what I hear from my friends, very, very bad in law firms. I have a friend who's one of the most distinguished lawyers in town who said that he's like one raised eyebrow away from being driven out of the firm. And this again, this is so radically different from what I faced. It's been more than 30 years since I was in with a law firm, but I liked my colleagues. I was well liked by my colleagues. I was the same person back then. Now it's difficult for me to imagine what the environment would be like.
Well, you do see people splintering off, right? So you saw Clement and Murphy break off and found their own firm. And so there's, I guess, on the positive side, there's this growing group of conservative boutique law firms that can take any case they want without, worrying about that the leadership of the firm won't allow it. So I guess that's a net positive, right? But I'm just trying to look on the bright side.
I want to introduce something really interesting. I think that Heather McDonald wrote in City Journal, which she applies it to the university writ large. But I want to ask you guys about its application here, because what I said in the beginning is really true. The particular therapeutic language of this dean, right? She's standing up there, she's wielding power over this event as an administrator, as a representative of the law school. And she's saying, I'm so uncomfortable, right? I feel so uncomfortable up here as she's wielding power. And there's this, to me, maddening, but like there's this very familiar therapeutic cadence to what she's talking about, where Jennifer also mentioned, like, oh, you're tearing the fabric of this community, right? There are these like sort of therapeutic phrases that get repeated over and over again. Heather McDonald wrote this recently. Sorry, this is bad. It's on top, overlaid on top of us. But she wrote this piece in City Journal about the feminization of the American university, where she points to the fact that women make up 66% of college administrators. They are the majority of students. I believe they are now the strong majority of students in law schools in particular. And then she writes, female students and administrators often exist in a codependent relationship, united by the concepts of victim identity and of trauma. For university females, there is not apparently strength in numbers. The more females' ranks increase, the more we hear about a mass nervous breakdown on campus. Female students disproportionately patronize the burgeoning university wellness centers, massage therapies, relaxation oases, calming corners, and healing circles. So she points to this relationship between the concept of the university as essentially as like a therapeutic place, rather than having a concrete end towards truth, or in this case, towards learning the practice of law. And this is not to say that only women or female students or female administrators behave this way, but she's pointing to this sort of feminization and therapeuticization, if that's a word, of the university. What do you think about that thesis? I guess Tim first and then Ed. What do you think about that thesis? Do you experience that kind of therapeuticization of education in Stanford Law School and beyond? And then what do you think, what impact? I mean, we've already talked about it, but like, is this kind of environment actually going to be able to produce, forgetting about billable hours and 80-hour work weeks in a law firm, are we going to be able to produce prosecutors who can, for example, prosecute rape out of this kind of therapeutic environment?
Well, I think there are a couple things here. So first, there's definitely something very weird about the way the university is set up here. We have graduate student housing and there are all these administrators who, plan events and help you manage things with your roommate. And you're like, this is housing for people in their late 20s and older. If they were real adults, like, I grew up in Cleveland. People my age in Cleveland rent apartments. And if they don't get along with their roommates, they work it out. They don't call their landlord and say, I need you to come and,
Facilitate.
bring me free food and
Yeah.
facilitate. Yeah. I mean, you have to be an adult at some point. So this daycare for very old people is not good. Something that for some reason, George Will, I actually met a long time ago, but have not talked to you about this, is the only article that sort of mentions, and just sort of an aside, the president of the Stanford Federal Society is an openly gay man. I'm openly gay. And that's probably not a great sign that the two best men you have on our side at the moment at the good schools is going to be me and Amy Wax, right? Like, the only people willing to tough it out. And so what happened actually, that the only men who are vocal at Stanford Law School tend to be gay men. It's this very interesting thing because, when we're vocal and when we are aggressive, our aggression is never focused on women. I think it's this very interesting thing. So it's okay, right? We can be outspoken. We can get away with saying things that the straights can't, because the straights have to be, they have to really like Biden, and they have to really keep their heads down, and they have to really, really be committed to allyship. And that's how they sort of make it through. And that's a bad thing. I think something very, very diabolically wrong has happened. So I don't know that feminization per se is what it is, but it's certainly this infantilization that we're going to, keep everyone in sort of an adult daycare until they are in their 30s. And as part of that, sort of straight male energy is very bad, right? You really don't want that, because it leads to Title IX problems, and it leads to aggression, and there's things.
Yeah, there's
So
no dad is coming home in an hour energy in these universities. You know what I
right,
mean? There's
right.
there's nowhere where the buck stops. No one with responsibility. This applies to men and women, but there's none of that sort of dad puts his foot down at the end of the day energy with any of these people.
No, no. There's dad is probably an older straight professor who is hanging on, who will go to the faculty senate and say his piece and then be ridiculed. And that's if dad is very
No,
courageous.
no, no. He
Otherwise,
won't
they
just be
get nothing.
ridiculed. He'll be brought up on Title IX charges for
Well,
speaking.
but I can tell you who those people are at Stanford. They really fight hard. Russell Berman particularly is incredibly courageous. Uh, and I think he used to be the president of MLA, so he can kind of get away with saying some things. But he is saying just obviously true things, and everyone just sort of stares at him. It is nuts.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that the bureaucrats in many of these places outnumber the faculty, and even where they don't outnumber the faculty, they have power over tenured faculty that they didn't used to have, and they can ruin their lives. And so even the so-called grown-ups in the room, particularly if they're straight white males, are afraid to speak up. Now, maybe if you're a member of a supposedly marginalized group, even if you're just a woman, right? Even if you're a majority, it sort of empowers you to speak up a little bit, because you could say, well, I don't agree with this as a woman. But yeah, people are afraid because the bureaucrats have too much power. And really, when you get back to Inez's earlier question about what can we do about this, we need to start with firing the bureaucrats. We start with the DEI bureaucrats, but it's not just them. It's the student life bureaucrats, the Title IX bureaucrats. I mean, that we need to cut down university bureaucracies by about 80 or 90%.
And may I just say one other thing on this? The language of I'm not comfortable. This is actually part of the problem. And I said it in the terms of making daycare for 3-year-olds. But by the time you are in graduate school, school probably shouldn't be comfortable, right? We shouldn't torture students, but law school in particular, it's very academically hard. You really do have to have your beliefs challenged. If you're going to enter this profession, which also is hard, it should be challenging. And this idea that our goal is comfort is a misplaced one, right? Even if you get rid of the administrative bureaucracy, if the university's focus is how can we make this a comfortable environment, that's not going to work. You see, they keep adding administrators, they keep adding counselors, they keep adding therapy dogs or whatever. The suicide rates up, the stress and anxiety up. It turns out this isn't like a Marxist thing where you can just pour more input into it and people will feel more better. Focusing on comfort was the wrong idea. We should say, we're going to create great advocates and great lawyers, and if somebody does something that is egregious, that really makes somebody miserable, like we have a professor say, I'm going to make, shame people loudly and publicly. Maybe that's not great, but we're not going to have all this infrastructure
Well,
around.
Filarito shamed me publicly and loudly on a weekly basis. I mean, that was
Not anymore.
be a lawyer.
Well,
Have they gotten rid of cold calling? I'm just curious. Have
We
they totally
kind of
gotten
have
rid of
cold
like the
calling, but
Socratic method and cold calling?
you can pass and you can email in advance and say, I'm not up to it today. My mental health won't allow me to be cold called. Sort of the standard thing is have a panel, so you're going to be cold called, but like one of these 2 days. So it's all just much more sort of calm now. And I'm not sure the classroom is the problem, but sort of the over wraparound that we're going to like run a daycare, not good.
Right.
Well, I agree with Tim that this daycare paradigm accurately describes things. As a father of 3 strong young women and the father-in-law of another, I'm reluctant to use the term feminization for this, though I can see Heather McDonald's point that there certainly is a cohort of women scholars who have been pushing this therapeutic daycare type notion. But again, the question isn't simply, will we have people who can, prosecute or defend bad guys in court? Will we have people who can step up to be fathers and mothers and husbands and wives and raise the next generation? I don't know how much of this is a result of a breakdown in the family and how much of it is going to be an accelerant in the future. But what model do we have for young people about what their lives ought to be like, about where happiness is really found? I think Tim makes a profound point that this temptation of comfort. No, that's not. Being coddled like a baby is not a way, especially is not a way to think that you've achieved something. And so we need to have a very different ethos in our university. But again, how we go about changing that's a huge question, well beyond my insights.
Yeah. And it starts at the very earliest ages. I mean, I have neighbors and relatives with young children, and I'll often hear them say, well, I just want my kids to be happy. And I always respond by saying, no, you don't. You want them to be resilient. Right? I mean, you shouldn't want them to be happy, because if you want them to be happy, you're setting them up for failure, because nobody's happy all the time. And what you should try to achieve in parenting is to raise resilient children. And if your children are resilient, then they will be happy more often than they're not. So maybe on that note, that's.
But I think Ed hit something I really wish I'd hit. When he said, functioning mothers, fathers, people in the community. I mean, it's just functioning people. I think the way we have this set up right now, we actually decrease resilience over the course of a graduate program, because you're told just sort of the functioning things you have to do to be an adult, like signing a lease and getting along with roommates or whatever, or a family. We'll take care of that. The ability to make friends. Well, we'll have events. We'll create belonging. I mean, you're going to go to some strange city and again work 80 hours a week at a law firm. You need to be able to make friends and get along with people and have human connection. And I don't see Skadden creating this, but maybe they will. I mean, maybe that's going to be the future. The law firms will each have to say, now we're going to have, a cultural event to help you make friends and to have belonging. But this is nuts. I mean,
it's really nuts.
Really tell people join a church, right? That's sort of.
Yeah, we've really replaced, I think, every framework with the therapeutic, right? Starting with instead of a family, you have therapy, or that some therapeutic language of some sort. Instead of employment, you have therapy. Instead of entertainment, you have therapy. Instead of church, you have therapy.
And it doesn't work.
And it doesn't work. It makes people unhappy, and as Jennifer said, not resilient.
I mean, maybe it could work if it delivered on its promise, right? The promise of this will make you a better person, but it has a tendency to crash down into you're a fine person as you are. And if you went into therapy knowing full well that you were not fine as you were, sort of spending all this money and time to have that be the solution is incredibly demoralizing.
Right.
Well, on that note, appropriately philosophical, I think. On that note, we're going to have to wrap up. We're coming to the end of our time here. But Tim, Ed, thank you so much for joining at the bar. This has been a really enlightening discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to urge people to check out Ed's new Substack, which is called Confirmation Tales. It's a really riveting look at the confirmation process from behind the scenes, and a historical look at big confirmation battles of the past. So anybody who's interested in the law and the courts and how judges are appointed, nominated, and confirmed should check that out. Confirmation Tales on Substack.com.
And as always, At the Bar is a production of the Independent Women's Forum. It's available for viewing on Facebook, YouTube, and IWF.org. And you can also listen to it as a podcast on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and anywhere that you get your podcasts.
We hope you'll join us next time for another spirited conversation about issues at the intersection of law, politics, and culture.